8,
You're watching
7,
Experience Comic Culture and Sales,
5,
streaming live daily to
4,
Facebook, YouTube,
3,
Twitch, and Twitter.
2, 1.
Hey everybody, how you doing? We've got a fun show today. What we're going to do is we have IP lawyer Michael Lovitz is going to be joining us, but we're having a slight technical issue of some echo. So what we're going to do is we will have Mike on. I will ask him some questions, and then I will be muted. He will answer back and forth. So there won't be a lot of talking over each other, but we'll make this work. The reason we want to have him on, of course, is the whole thing with Bill Willingham and the Fables public domain thing. So we're going to get right to that. Let me go ahead. We'll do the opening, and then we'll get right to Michael. So be right back. All right, everybody. We have Michael Lovitz with us, IP extraordinaire lawyer. And I actually have interviewed Michael once before, back when my days with Bleeding Cool, and he was doing panels at San Diego Comic-Con. So what I wanted to do was have him on because the whole thing with public domain and Bill Willingham coming out and saying, hey, Fable's in the public domain, and DC coming out going, no, it's not. So, but what I want to start with, Michael, is, and this was something JD and I were talking about just before the show started. First question has got to be, why is there a public domain? If I create a book like Karma or The Freeze, and it's my creation, why is there a ticking clock on it? What is the purpose of public domain? Why does it exist?
That's a really good question, and I do want to point out the irony in DC saying that Fables, which are all public domain characters repurposed for that series, are not public domain. But that being said, it's Bill's version that we're going to be talking about. But let me go to your question, and that really stems from the way that the Constitution was originally written. It's actually within the Constitution that the government will protect for limited times the writings and inventions of authors and inventors. And the concept there really is that the government wants to encourage the sharing of ideas, the sharing of creations and works of authorship, whether it be photographs, paintings, comic book scripts, whatever it might be. They want to encourage that sharing into the general zeitgeist of society, but want to do so in a way that the authors and inventors have a limited monopoly period where they can exercise the rights and profit from those works. Now, in patent law, it's a very short period. It's 20 years, whereas in copyright, it's the life of the author plus 70 years. If it's an anonymous or pseudonymous work, or a work that's created by a company, for instance, it's 95 years from creation, 95 years from publication, or 120 years from creation, whichever is shorter. So it doesn't seem limited, but it is limited to a degree. But for copyrights, limited in a large enough number so that for your lifetime and for the lifetime of your children, you'll be able to profit from your creative works before they're thrust into the public domain.
Okay. Now, it's kind of interesting to me, and I've seen this on a few, you talked about Bill's using a lot of public domain characters in this. But you see that a lot with comic books, characters like the Black Terror, stuff like that. But it's also kind of tricky. Like if you're a creator and you want to get into using a public domain character, you really have to pay attention to when things are created. Because I like a character like, it's going to seem like a really random character, but Boston Blackie. Boston Blackie was created in a novel by Jack Boyle in 1910. But then they did radio programs and matinee shows and stuff like and serials in the 40s and the 50s where they introduced a bunch of characters. So even though the characters in the public domain, it's only the characters from the original book, not the stuff that was created later on. So how do people keep track of all that, or how does that?
And it is not the easiest thing in the world to keep track of, and there are many examples of issues that you can find that we see in regular media. And I was just reading a post the other day by a comic book writer who's going to be taking on a new Dracula series, which is based off of the Universal Monsters version of Dracula, which is Dracula is in the public domain, but the Universal Pictures version of Dracula is not. And so now you have a comic book that's going to be based on this movie, which still is protected. And so you're absolutely right. You have to be very careful which source material you go to when you're working with public domain characters. And it gets even trickier than that, because you'll have characters which are in the public domain in the United States, but which are still protected by copyright in Europe, because the European measure of copyright protection was longer than that of the United States prior to 1978. And so there they recognized that Life Plus system, whereas in the US that was not the recognized version. In the US prior to 1978, it was 28 years, renewable for a second 28 years. So 56 years was the max. But we were alone in the world in that the limited system. And so we decided to join the rest of the world in their copyright protections, partly so that we could get benefits for our authors that were appropriate in those other countries. Because when we joined the Berne Convention, that's Bern like Switzerland, Berne. When we joined the Berne Convention, part of the reason we did that was for the reciprocity, so that our creators, our authors, would get the same benefits abroad in any of the other countries that were members of the Berne Convention as they would get in the United States. And so you wanted to make sure that that scope of protection was sufficiently extensive. Plus, in order to join that convention, that International Copyright Convention, we had to match certain terms, including that length of protection. But you'll have characters like Tarzan, for instance, or Sherlock Holmes, which may have been in the public domain in the US, but were actually still protected in Europe and other countries. I'm not speaking today, I'm speaking from past experience, but you'd have those scenarios arise. And so it is very complicated, and there is no real easy, bright line test necessarily, other than life plus 70. If you can go back and you can find the work that you want to reference and create derivative works from, and you can clearly demonstrate that the author died more than 70 years ago, then you should be safe anywhere in the world. But you have to then be careful not to trip over these alternate versions which are out there. How many versions of Sherlock Holmes do we have that we've seen in movies and television? And so you don't want to be borrowing from any of those. You want to go back to the original source material. If you borrow from something else, you have to make sure that that other thing you're borrowing from is also in the public domain. Otherwise, you run a risk.
Some of our commenters were talking about Winnie the Pooh, which is now in the public domain, but without the red shirt, so they can't use them in the red shirt. Which,
sorry. I thought you were going to pick up again. No, so right. That's an instance where if you go to the original books, the books themselves, he's not shown as wearing a red shirt. He's just a stuffed teddy bear. But when Disney went and did the various cartoons that they've done, they made changes and both to him and to Winnie the Pooh himself, as well as to some of the other characters. They made some tweaks, made them more uniform and more palatable for what they felt was appropriate for children, and at the same time put their own unique spin on, the same way that the Universal did with Frankenstein and Dracula and the Mummy and the Werewolf. And so in doing so, they made sure that they would have some extra protection going forward, separate and apart from what was in the original source material. And that really nicely ties into Fables.
I'd love to have been in the meeting at Disney where they went, you know what we need? We need shirts on the duck and the bear, but the mouse needs pants or shorts. Okay. I am curious. It seems like we come up to these laws or these points where it's like, okay, this character is now going to be in the public domain, and then the goalpost gets moved a little bit. How often has that changed? I mean, I know Disney has done it with Mickey Mouse, stuff like that. How much has the public domain laws changed besides with the Berne Convention? I mean, is there room for these companies to make these things move?
So I want to kind of disabuse you of that position, and I've heard that before. And Disney, neither Disney nor Apple nor anyone else has the ability to change the laws that applies to them. What had happened with respect to the copyright and the extension of the copyright, first we did the change in 1976, which was to join the Berne Convention. But then the rules changed elsewhere. So originally in 1976, the length of copyright protection was life plus 50 years. Then that changed elsewhere to being, I think Europe was the main driver, to life plus 70. So again, the US had to make a similar change in order to stay in line with the rest of the Berne members, to make that life plus 70 as the baseline. Now, was Disney lobbying heavily for that term extension? I'm pretty sure they were, as were other major corporations, Warner Brothers, etc. But it had a realistic and well documented and well supported basis outside of these companies pushing for it. Now, I don't know if companies in Europe were the ones who pushed for it to go from life to 50 plus life plus 70. That I'm unclear on, but I know within the U.S. It's what we refer to as the Sonny Bono extension copyright term extension act, because he was a representative at the time, and moved it so that we were again in line with the rest of the world. There's been no changes since then, and there's been no discussions of any changes to further extend the copyright term. So I don't anticipate at this stage that there will be any furtherance. But the other element that comes into this, because intellectual property is not just copyrights, it's patents and trademarks. And the copyrights and trademarks have a great deal of interplay and when it comes to protections and length of protections. And that's essentially what we see to some degree with those Universal monsters and some of the Disney stuff. And that is, if you take your version of a character that is protected by copyright and start to use it in a trademark manner, well, trademarks never die. unless you stop using them. So trademarks can live forever. And so it's very interesting to see how a lot of steps are being taken by these different companies, including Disney, who started introducing at the beginning of their animated films a short clip that came from the original Mickey Mouse cartoon, Steamboat Willie, and there's I want to say it's a 5 or 10 second clip of him steering the boat and whistling. Now, eventually, that clip is going to become public domain as it will be part of that cartoon that will enter the public domain. But at the same time, that clip is being used in a trademark manner, because if you have the television on and you walk into the room and you see that clip, you automatically understand that whatever comes after that clip is a Disney film. And so it serves that trademark purpose. And it will be interesting to see how much they use that to try to block other people making commercial use of Steamboat Willie once it enters the public domain formally.
Okay, this leads to my next question. And it's kind of what Ed's asking. If it's 70 years after the life of the author or the creator, if that creator works for, like with Superman, when Siegel and Schuster is at the length of their life, and then 70 if it's now owned by Warner Brothers, or like the case with Winnie the Pooh, is it the death of Walt Disney? Is it the death of the original creator? How does it work when the ownership transfers?
So that depends on how the ownership ends up transferring. And let me go into a little bit of basics when it comes to the authorship question. And so under US copyright law, authorship is attributed to the person or persons who actually author the works in question. If there are multiple authors, like in most comic book cases, there you have a work of joint authorship. And there, for example, we would measure that life plus 70 from the date of the final death. Not the first, but the last person to die would be what you would measure that 70 years from. So that's the typical, and Siegel and Schuster created Superman and then sold the rights to DC Comics. So again, those rights would be tied to their lifetimes. And we look at which of the two of them as joint authors was the last to pass away for that measurement of 70 years. But there's a different approach that applies when you have works made for hire. And a work made for hire, and we're going to talk about in this instance, a work made for hire being by an author who is a full-time employee of a company, which is where we see most of this stuff. And so if we're thinking about Disney and Winnie the Pooh and who authored the Winnie the Pooh cartoons, those were animators who were full-time employees of Disney who worked for them. And so in that category, the work is being done anonymously because no one person is attributed to the authorship there. The company is. And the company is not a living person, so we do not count that as a life plus, because if we did, and Disney never ceases to operate, then it would be for Disney's existence plus 70 years. That would be never ending. Instead, in those instances, we look at that other formula that I mentioned: 95 years from publication or 120 years from creation, whichever is shorter. So we look at that as a scenario instead when we're dealing with works made for hire, where the owner is not a living individual.
Okay, so stuff like Marvel that Stan Lee created, with him having just passed away, 7, 8 years ago? So there's still 60 plus years that these things are going to be under copyright. before it ever hits public domain. Okay.
Yeah, it's absolutely, and in the case of those kinds of characters, more importantly, you're going to be restricted. Anyone is going to be restricted because the trademarks will never expire, and so it will be more difficult to have a third party start doing a Fantastic Four comic book. Because they wouldn't be able to use any of the trademarks, including the title of Fantastic Four, as well as any trademarked elements of the characters themselves that appear in Fantastic Four, Doctor Doom, etc.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, let's go ahead and shift over to Fables now. Now, I assume you're up on this. This is kind of your area of expertise anyway. So Bill Willingham is not happy with the way he's being treated by DC, Warner Brothers. And he basically came out and said that he's putting the works, the Fables universe that he created, into the public domain. Now, there's a lot of questions that come from that. Like, can somebody do that? Just drop their work into the public domain? And what does that mean? Before we get to DC's response, just, can Bill even do this?
So what Bill did is very, very much akin to the open source software segment. And if you're familiar with that at all, where some people will create software code or a language and say, hey, this is for anyone else to use. There's a Community Commons license that's available to anyone. You just have to follow certain restrictions. You're in that, you can't block other people from using what is here in generally accessible to everyone, et cetera, et cetera. So it's similar to that. And he's basically saying, I've created this universe of characters. I've created this, version of our Earth, essentially. Here are all the different parallel worlds where the different characters came from. Here are the big bads. Here's how these people interact with one another. Here's the history of these people. So I've fleshed this all out for you. So take this world and go and build more from that. In the same way that under the Creative Commons, you can do that with open source software. You can take that software and create apps and create downloadable programs, whatever, games, whatever it might be that you could derive from that open source. You go and do it, and everyone's free to do it. The important thing, and I know you said we'll get into DC's response, but the important thing to remember is what Bill has done is very similar, like I said, to what happened with Walt Disney and Pooh. And so they took this existing IP, and same with Universal Pictures. They took this existing IP, they did their version of it, and their version is protected. And so it's very interesting to see how DC will respond. And I'm not taking any bets anyway on this one, but it will be interesting to see how DC responds when someone does the first Fables-based universe or Fables universe work that's different from or separate from the published works. And at one point, there had to have been a detailed understanding between Willingham and DC as to who owns what, and it's in their contract, which is not available for us to see. I'm sure it's confidential, and no one will have that. If it's not confidential, Bill, please send it to me. I'd love to analyze it and figure out how this all would work. But nevertheless, there may be restrictions. I think Willingham himself said, anything that I write has to be published by DC. Anything I write involving these characters. That's what the contract says. So there have to be some of those limitations, but that's a contractual limitation as opposed to a copyright limitation. Under the copyright law, if Bill Willingham has decided, I'm throwing this all out here, here's the architecture, here's the giant DM's map and role-playing guide, so you can figure out how this game module is supposed to work, but you go and do what you want with it. And so you can create your own adventure, you can create your own world. The difference there is you're getting a bit of a license through D&D, whereas you're not really getting that license through Willingham, because he doesn't really have a license to grant, since I imagine most of that license lies with DC.
Now, it's one thing to look at would be exactly what it is he's putting out there, because most of these characters already exist in the public domain. You know, there are characters that were already out there, the big bad wolf and fairy tale stuff. And there's a lot of trademark stuff that he can't put out there, like probably the name Fables as a comic. So trademarking a single word seems difficult sometimes. But
like Apple?
Yeah. So it seems like what he's really just putting out there are the connections he made between those characters. You know, the interactions, the existing stories. You know, that, okay, the big bad wolf is actually a detective. That's something that he created. So that's really all he's put out there. He didn't really put the characters out there because they already exist. And a lot of the names and stuff are probably trademarked. So how much is he really putting out there?
Well, and that's the $1 million question here, and that's a really good question. And again, part of the answer lies in the contract itself, because what I don't know is, was this a fully creator-owned, in the sense that I'm creating this, it's my copyright, but I'm granting you, DC, the license to do this stuff, and as long as it's in print, that license continues, and I can't take that license away from you, but it's still my copyright because it's my creator-owned work. Or is this a case where, hey, I've come up with this concept, let's do a shared copyright? And that's the thing, without knowing where the actual ownership of the copyright is, it's hard to be able to predict what can or cannot be done with some of the work that Willingham has put into creating these multiple worlds and universe that he has created for us. Certainly, no one has the right, and I was going to say before I forget, and it got muddled even more, because at one point we now have a crossover between the Fables world and the DC universe because of the Batman Bigby crossover that we had, and so again, the question is, where does DC's copyright firmly lie, and how much can they block others from using what was published in the first 160 or however many issues he's up to at this point? I don't know if we hit 160 yet, but of Fables, plus all of the spin-offs and all the other things that were done between Fairest and 1001, etc. So is this merely you can take this blueprint and off of the blueprint create your own stuff, as long as you don't use existing storylines and reprint any of the stuff that was done by DC? Or is it even to the extent that DC's publications have certain versions of the characters, so you cannot use their Snow White, or the Snow White that appeared in what they published? You can't use Bigby and call him Bigby and make him the big bad wolf and make him the what is it, is it the North Wind? I forget which wind he's the son of, and all of those kinds of elements and specific ideas that were in the DC comics. We need to know who owns the copyright in those comics before we can decide what really is available out there.
Now, looking at this, I could see DC wanting to like pull Bill aside and quietly work this out. But it seems like this may be something that they're really going to want to get some legal groundwork down on, because I could see, yes, Bill's the first one to do this, but somebody like Alan Moore, who has long-standing feuds with DC, start doing this as well if it's actually plausible. That could cause DC problems. So, do you think this is something that DC might try to just quietly take care of, or is this something that they're going to want to kind of put a big hammer down on to put lay it out straight?
So I'm not sure that it requires a giant hammer, and that's because this really is unique and different in a lot of ways from your traditional comic book creation, in that we're dealing here with a creator-owned title. And to the extent that there are creator-owned titles out there, and we think of Image and parts of DC through Vertigo and things like that, to the extent that you actually have creator-owned titles out there, the concept is that the creator owns the property and the characters, and there are some contractual restrictions and obligations that have to be fulfilled. But otherwise, it's my toys as the creator of the creator-owned property, and I can play with my toys and do with my toys however I want. In the case of something like Watchmen, which is derivative, and it's derivative of the Charlton characters, and it was his version of those characters that were originally going to be done one way, and then, wait, we don't want to lose the characters the way you're about to kill off all of these different characters and things like that. Can't we do this Watchmen version of those characters? There's what I don't know in that instance is whether it was full work for hire, which I imagine it was, versus creator owned. So I can't, if I'm Siegel and Schuster, who have passed away, so this is why it's a good hypothetical. If I'm Siegel and Schuster, I can't just willy-nilly say Superman's in the public domain, because I don't have the rights to do that at that point, because I've sold those rights to someone else. I don't have the ability, legal ability, to be able to do that. In this instance with Willingham, where it's creator owned, he has the ability to say it's going in the public domain, the same way that Todd McFarlane can say Spawn's in the public domain. He's not going to, but he could. But that's his advantage of working for Image, that he owns or partially owns, is that he doesn't worry about what Image is doing with his title, because it's what he wants to do with the title. So I don't think it's a matter of putting a hammer down or quietly. I think it's just a matter of educating people on what the announcement by Willingham means, and to what extent what he's talking about would or would not work. Now, I say that, but in a lot of ways, I don't know that DC necessarily wants to reveal what you can and cannot do. I think they'd rather be more ambiguous, and that way there's a greater threat or cloud that's overarching the property that makes you hesitate before you do anything with it, because, oh, will DC sue me over this? Or, I mean, might they get angry if I do a Snow White and Briar Rose when they were teenagers story, even though they've never done one of those? I mean, can I get away with that? Or are they going to sue me over that? Oh no, I don't know, because no one's telling me what actually is my rights or my limitations. So I think it's more likely to be quiet, not because they want to quietly make it go away, but because by being somewhat quiet, it makes it murkier.
That makes a lot of sense. We have a question in the chat. says there really isn't a provision in the law allowing an artist to rescind the government's copyright protection, is there? Even if Willingham doesn't defend his copyright, it would still exist, right? Couldn't DC defend it in his name?
Again, it depends. It depends what the contract says, and it depends who owns the copyright. But the copyright law does have provisions, or at least I should say the Copyright Office. If the copyright law itself doesn't, I have to double check that. But the Copyright Office has a provision whereby you can surrender your copyright registrations and surrender your copyright rights. And as long as it's a publicly announced thing, you can do that. You can essentially donate it to the public. There is nothing stopping you from doing that. Is there a particular part of the copyright statute? I don't recall off the top of my head, but I do know, and maybe it's in the CFR rather than in the statute, but I certainly know under the Copyright Office rules, there are circulars where it talks about this very prospect of being able to surrender the copyright or donate the copyright essentially to the public.
All right, just to wrap this up, and then we'll let you go. How do you see this working out? I mean, is this going to start a new trend? Is this kind of a one-off? You know, what do you see coming out of what Bill's doing?
So I think there are a lot of elements that will come from this, both in IP elements and in practical elements. On the practical side, creator-owned works that you bring to a major publisher like Marvel or DC are going to come with a lot of strings attached. And sometimes those strings aren't going to be good ones. So for creators who are working on creative-owned works, you have to be very careful. The kinds of deals you enter into and your ability to walk away from those should be one of the things that you give thought to. And certainly, and I talk about this every year in my San Diego panels, my comic book law school panels. Certainly, before signing that kind of a contract with a publisher, please find a lawyer to help you, just to make sure that they can go through and point out some of these issues and concerns, so that you know exactly what it is you're in for. So I think what this is going to do, in the same way that the Alan Moore discussions that have been had over the years, and how he's donating. Now he's donating funds. But he's donating funds from various things because he doesn't have ownership. So I think what this is going to do for creator-owned works is make creators a little bit more careful about the kinds of deals they enter into and their ability to get out of those deals and walk away with their property so they can go do more things on their own without being tied to the original publisher if they get into a dispute with the original publisher. You know, the counter to that, of course, is publishers are less likely to give you a sweetheart deal if they don't have any real skin in the game. So, but that's from a practical perspective. From a legal perspective, I think what's going to be interesting is to see when someone decides that they want to push this issue. And it's in the same way that, and you're probably aware, Dan, I don't know if everyone in the audience is aware, that there is a trademark for superhero and for another trademark for supervillain. And those are registered trademarks, and they are owned by Marvel and DC jointly. Now, one of the things we learn in trademark law is you can't get trademark rights on words which are exceptionally descriptive or generic. And that's why you can have Apple for computers, because Apple has no meaning as applied to computers or phones or tablets, but you can't register Apple for pies, because everyone needs to be able to call their apple pie Apple on the sticker that they apply to the pie. So you would think that supervillain and superhero are terms which are similarly really generic. But the reality is no one has stepped forward and challenged those registrations under the grounds that they're generic at this point. And anytime someone tries to, something gets worked out in terms of the settlement agreement with Marvel DC to avoid losing that. So similarly here, what it's going to take is someone to step forward and say, I'm going to do, and I gave you the example, I'm going to do a mini series about Snow White and Briar Rose set in their teen years before all of the trouble happened that sent everyone to Earth. That was the foundation for the Fable series that we know. We're going to tell an untold history type story, and put it out there and see what happens, and see if they get if they get sued, and where things end up. Obviously, before that can happen, someone has to sit down with Bill and say, what are my limitations here? I know you've thrown this stuff out there for anyone to use, but what are my limitations vis-a-vis DC? Once that kind of stuff happens, then we'll see the results of how much DC puts up a fight, and how difficult it is for someone to do that, and that'll set the guardrails for stuff going forward. But you're not going to see any kind of mass donation of copyrights, at least I don't believe, into the public domain, mostly because for the vast majority of these creator-owned series, the creators own the rights. So, why would Colleen Doran need to say A Distant Soil is now public domain when she fully controls A Distant Soil and everything that's in the series? So there's not going to be any kind of weird movement. You can't have someone like a Stan Lee or a Jack Kirby, or in today's parlance, a Dan Slott or a Joshua Williamson go in and say, all of my Batman stories, all of my Spider-Man stories are no, they can't do that. They don't have the ability to do that. This is really more about the creator-owned works, and it'll be interesting to see if someone challenges it, if someone takes Bill up on this this opportunity, and how things go once someone does do that.
All right. I appreciate your time, Michael. I know you're very busy, so I thank you very much for coming on and explaining this to everybody. So we're going to let you go, and we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the SAG, or the writer's strike ending, and wrap up the show. So we'll be right back. Again, thank you, Michael, very much.
My pleasure.
Did you know that every Experience show, including some exclusive content, streams on Twitch? Check it out. Twitch.tv/the_EXP. Or just scan that QR code.
There's something for every imagination at your local comic shop. Visit comicshoplocator.com to find a store near you.
everybody, welcome back. Thank you guys for indulging us on that little technical issue. It was kind of weird not being able just to have the actual interaction, but I think it worked out pretty well. Triple B, you need to get yourself a straw. Straw in the beer. It'll help you out there on the numb mouth. I just wanted to talk for a minute about the WGA strike ending and what a positive thing I think that is. It shows that the studios were ready to make a deal. It took them a while. They had to, wait it out, be delayed, and do their posturing. But this past week came up. It was obvious time for them to make a deal, and it made it quickly. I mean, I think it was like 3 or 4 days of actual negotiating, which is a great sign that the actors' strike they should be able to work out a deal with the SAG-AFTRA pretty quickly, because a lot of the things on the table were the same. The AI, the streaming numbers, stuff like that. And now that that's already worked out for the writers, it would be difficult for the studios to not give similar to the actors. So hopefully this will wrap things up pretty quickly, and then they'll be able to get back to work, and we could get back to seeing some of the shows and the movies and stuff we've been really waiting for. JD asked, do you think the strike was just to convenience the shareholders? They had no choice. I don't know. I think there's a certain amount of arrogance in running a studio. You think you know what's best. We see it with a lot of movies. We see a lot of, demands made by the studio, like, oh, we have to put Baby Grogu back with Din Djarin before season 3 of The Mandalorian. Wasn't the original plan. They forced it into Boba Fett. There's an arrogance that they believe they know what's best. And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. So it is possible that they really thought they were going to be able to work a better deal for themselves. And when when the writers and the actors didn't suddenly cave in, then they had to go, oh, hang on a second, we need to actually work this out. So I think that's part of it. But I also think that there was a certain amount of, for some studios like Warner Brothers, which has been short on cash. Well, if they're not paying anybody and they're able to end some of these deals that they had because of the strike, now how quickly they reform those deals, they might not. And it might be the way they kind of work back up their spending cash. So there probably was some point to it where they were saving money, but and spreading their movies out again, because with the pandemic, everything got kind of blocked together. They had almost too much stuff they were putting out, so now they're kind of taking a break. The strike gave them a chance to do a breather and spread things back out again, with a good reason. So we'll have to see how it all works out. But I expect that within a week or two, they'll be getting to a final deal with the actors. And hopefully by the end of October, everything will be back up and running. And we can get things back on track. And it's still going to push a lot of stuff. There's no way Deadpool's going to be ready for, I think it's a March release, or I don't see Captain America 4 being ready for a May release. So all this stuff is going to get pushed back. But I think once they get it back up and running, then we'll see what the numbers are going to actually be, what the dates of moving are going to be. So, all right, guys, I'm going to wrap it up there. We will talk Ahsoka tomorrow. We got the 7th episode dropped. So we will talk Ahsoka tomorrow. There's a lot going on. We haven't talked about the last couple issues. So tune in tomorrow for that. And stick around. We got a big lineup tonight. We got comics collectibles. We have talking treat trivia. We have 360 comics, and then kicking it with Henri. So long lineup tonight. Stick around for all that. Again, thanks for tuning in. I'm sorry again for the slight technical error, but I think we got it worked out. So everybody have a great night, and I will see you tomorrow.
Do you remember what it was like when you were a little kid and you got a letter in the mail? Now imagine that letter was filled with information about your favorite shows, pop culture questions, links to things you're going to want to see later, and even sneak peeks at upcoming programming here on The Experience. That's what the EXP mailing list is. Every week, we send you sneak peeks, information, and all of the relevant links for all of the shows you want to see. Sign up now on our website or scan the QR code that's on your screen right now.